Welcome to the Standard of Truth podcast, hosted by historian Dr. Garrett Dirkmaat, where we explore the early days of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and gain rare historical insights into how a young farm boy was able to establish a new church and grow it by way of visions, manifestations, and miracles.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Standard of Truth podcast. I'm your host, Garrett Dirkmaat, and I'm here with my friend Richard Leduc.
Yes, hello, Garrett. So in this particular podcast, we are going to do what we kind of hoped that the podcast would turn into. We've received several questions. And by the way, if you have questions, please send them to questions@standardoftruthpodcast.com. And we will try to answer those in future podcasts. But in this particular podcast, we're going to try to answer a question that Garrett received that was kind of unique.
Yeah, it's certainly unique. And we want you to send questions in, although we made the email that you send the questions to incredibly long and complicated. When you actually don't want questions, you're like, please send it to / questions / questions / I mean,
and the questions that we want are really anything with the exception of
things that are hard to answer. So we want easy questions and lots of them. Now, so this is a question it's a fairly unique question, but it actually opens up our opportunities to talk about some of the things we've already chatted about on the podcast before, but I hope you'll find them interesting. I received an email from a member of the church, from a woman who said that she had someone in her life share with her a video and an article talking about the fact that explaining that Joseph Smith had both received his visions and he had translated the Book of Mormon through the use of psychedelic drugs, such as toads and magical herbs and mushrooms, so psychedelic mushrooms. And this was something that troubled her. And she wanted to know, in fact, she wrote, "Oh, Brother Dirkmaat, I'm trying to keep an open mind. But this is probably a little too far." And she just wondered, is there evidence for this? I mean, it's an article, it was published. And so is there anything that's supporting this theory? Well, this is one of the great questions and problems when you're trying to figure out what actually happened in the past. So historians, their job is, through using sources, they try to determine what most likely happened in the past. So that's very different than someone who's just telling a good tale about what might have happened in the past, or a hypothetical of something that might happen. Historians try to say what most likely happened in the past using sources. Of course, there's all kinds of things you can say. You could say, well, isn't it possible that Joseph Smith did X? By the ideas that, things are possible, sure. I mean, there are things that are possible. Are they likely, however? And do you have sources that point to them as being likely, or do they just end up being, essentially a hypothesis, a dream? Well, let me tell you, this is where this idea comes from. Interestingly, the place that this idea comes from is actually from a place that scholars or other interested parties have more recently started to realize that there's a real problem with the simple blanket dismissal of Joseph Smith's truth claims. The problem is that Joseph Smith really seems to believe that he was called by God. Now, how do we know that? Well, I mean, look, we've gone through the Joseph Smith papers. We've gone through the 12, 13, 14,000 documents of Joseph Smith, the tens of thousands of pages, the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of words, and in all of them, private letters, private journals, public speeches, minutes of meetings that he's in, there isn't even a hint that Joseph Smith doesn't really believe that he was called by God. So the lazy way out of things is to simply, dismiss Joseph Smith by saying, oh yeah, well, Joseph Smith was a liar, and he just lied about having the first vision, and then he also lied about finding the plates, and then he lied about where the Book of Mormon came from, then he lied about other visions that he had, and then he lied about receiving revelations, and Joseph Smith's just a con artist at that point, right? Well, I realize for an antagonist, someone who hates the church and wants to attack it, that sounds like a really great argument. The problem is it doesn't have any historical documents backing it. There's a very, very, very big difference between Joseph Smith thinking that he saw God and earnestly and honestly believing that he saw God and deliberately deceiving other people. Those just aren't the same thing. So, first and foremost, it's important to recognize that there are various levels of these arguments.
So, Garrett, I've heard you explain before. So, if somebody is antagonistic toward the church, they would say something like you said, well, Joseph Smith's a liar, and he's just lied about everything, and he's a con artist, and whatever. But I've also heard you say that a historian who doesn't even believe that God exists, they wouldn't make a claim like that.
Yeah, most generally. I mean, look, there's lots of people who have PhDs. You might be able to find one somewhere who tries to make that claim, but the reality is that a common claim? Daniel Walker Howe, who wrote the Oxford History of the United States for this time period and covers Latter-day Saints, and just so everyone knows, is not a Latter-day Saint, he doesn't make that claim. So why doesn't this, Oxford history, why doesn't it say, Joseph Smith claimed that he saw God, but clearly he didn't see God because God doesn't exist and he just made this all up? Why doesn't he say that? Well, first of all, because he doesn't have that good of a radio voice. But second of all, because there's no evidence for that. Frankly, historians don't care whether or not God exists. Now, this particular historian cares a great deal that God exists, but in the field of history, our job isn't to prove whether or not someone actually saw God, because we don't believe, like we talked about in our introductory podcast, we don't believe that's provable. You can't prove whether or not someone saw God. All you can prove is whether or not someone said that they did, and whether or not they seem to earnestly believe it. Well, in Joseph Smith's case, he obviously earnestly believes it. And so even the authors of this particular article, one of the things that they state as the purpose of writing their article, let me quote from part of what they wrote. No single explanation has to date successfully accounted for the number and quality of visions in early Mormonism. Nor can these modalities explain the on-demand visions that were neither spontaneous nor the result of prolonged austerities. To date, Joseph Smith's and early Mormon converts' visionary experiences are neither easily defined nor understood. So first of all, I would say I agree with everything they just said. There isn't a good explanation, right? Anything that you want to say of, well, Joseph Smith was just super tired, and that's why he, when he went out to pray, he fell asleep and he had a dream where he thought he saw Jesus, but of course he didn't see Jesus because no one sees Jesus, and he was just really tired, and that's the reason why he thought he saw him. Okay, well, let me just grant you that. I will grant you that the first vision, Joseph Smith was just asleep. That's where it came from. Now, where do the 3 appearances from Moroni in one night, and then once the next morning, and then again when he goes to the place, where do the 5 appearances of Moroni in 24 hours come from? Well, he was also obviously really tired. And then where does, when he has the heavens opened up to him and he sees, Doctrine and Covenants section 76, sees the vision, and he sees Jesus, and he sees God, and he sees the heavens, also he's just super tired. And then Elijah and Moses and Elias come, and again, very tired. He's a hard worker. He's very tired.
Farm work is it's taxing.
He's received a revelation telling him to not drink as much tea and coffee. So, I mean, frankly, he's going to be more tired. You can see the problem with this kind of an argument. Obviously, I'm being a little bit facetious, a lot of bit facetious. But the point is, if you're going to try to claim, here's the reason why he honestly thought he was having visions, the problem is Joseph Smith isn't claiming that he had a vision one time. He's claiming he had a vision multiple times. And by the way, there are other people claiming to have those visions with him, right? So yes, Joseph Smith is just incredibly tired when the angel appears to show them the plates for the 3-witness experience. But then also, apparently David Whitmer and Oliver Cowdery also super tired. And then later, in a separate event, because he wasn't worthy to be there the first time, Martin Harris and Joseph there, both equally as tired, both equally having this. You can see the problem. Now again, a historian actually doesn't try to work this out. A historian isn't trying to disprove these phenomenological events. If you find someone trying to disprove a phenomenological event, they're not doing history. They're doing all kinds of things. At this point, they might be doing psychedelic mushrooms, but they are not doing history. What they're doing is theorizing, because they're going beyond what a source can actually prove. No source can prove whether or not an angel appeared to Joseph Smith. Believers can believe that an angel appeared to Joseph Smith, but a historian is simply going to report Joseph Smith consistently claimed that an angel appeared to him and gave him gold plates. Now, if you don't believe that, you don't have to believe it. But there's a very big difference between saying, well, I personally find it pretty hard to believe that an angel appeared to him. Yeah, of course it's hard to believe. It's called a miracle. So by definition, it's something that you wouldn't believe otherwise. So the very fact that it's hard to believe it's actually, for a believer, that's why I believe it. So even these authors, what they're stating is the whole reason why they're writing this theory. And by the way, what they call their article is a working hypothesis. Whenever you see the term working in the title of any academic work, what it means is we don't have anything. It's a way of authors saying, I have some ideas. Wouldn't it be cool if these ideas had some kind of proof for them? That's what a working hypothesis is. Like, what if the real reason why the Twin Towers came down was there was actually a bomb that was placed inside of it, and that's the reason. I mean, well, if that were the case, that would be incredibly important to know. Well, the problem is that if looms incredibly large there. Because again, historians try to deal with what most likely happened in the past. Or in this case, when we're dealing with phenomenology, when you're dealing with miracles, historians aren't trying to prove whether a miracle happened or didn't happen. They're trying to prove, did this person consistently claim that the miracle happened?
So where does the Book of Mormon play into also the apparent sincere belief of Joseph Smith that all of these things occurred from a historical standpoint? You also have the Book of Mormon. Does that play?
Well, into this particular article, it also plays in. I mean, the person is going to claim, the authors here are going to claim. Now, I should state, none of the authors of this article are historians. You know, one's, a retired emergency department physician. One is an independent researcher, and one is someone who has a PhD in social sciences, and they're a retired professor who focuses on people using hallucinogenics in religious experiences. So all of the people writing this are not actually trained in the use of historical sources. They might be trained. They're certainly trained in other things, or maybe not, depending. But being a medical doctor doesn't make you a historian. No more than I always tell my wife that she married a doctor, just the kind of doctor that doesn't make any money and can't help anybody. But they're different kinds of specialties, right? I don't have the ability to perform open heart surgery. That's not what my training's in, and so it's more about specialty rather than intelligence. I mean, it's not about how smart someone is. You can be incredibly smart, and you're trained in a certain thing. I'm trained in history. That's what I'm trained in. I'm not trained in anthropology. I understand aspects of anthropology. I've read books on anthropology. I've taken class on anthropology. Am I an expert in that? No, that's not my discipline. So this article was published in the Journal of Psychedelic Studies, which, first of all, it sounds like one that you want to run out and get a subscription to. As far as journals go, it's a very low tier. It's a brand new journal. Essentially, it's only been around since 2017, and it's an online only journal, and it's published by a Hungarian conglomerate of publishers in Hungary. So it's not a top tier journal. In fact, I actually don't even know what the peer review process is.
Well, so I was going to say, so this is very important as it relates to the tiering of journals, that people that have more of a social life than perhaps that we might. What does that mean in terms of the tiering of journals?
So, there are various different types of journals in every discipline, and some are considered higher tier, meaning they're much more difficult to get published in. The academic backing behind them is higher. They have a higher circulation. For a lot of them, it's based upon how many articles they reject. So if you have a journal that everyone wants to get published in, well, then you might have, hundreds of people submit submissions to that journal every single year, and only 10% actually get published. Well, what does that mean? It means the ones that actually make it through the process, because those journals have a much more rigorous process. And a tier 2 or a 3 or a 4 or whatever, lower level journal doesn't have so many submissions, can't have as rigorous as standards for the publication, and so they might publish something that, wouldn't see the light of day in a higher level journal. But for theirs, well, we need to fill some pages.
So and this matters quite a bit for tenure. This matters for just, I mean, if you're at a relatively prominent university, you're required to publish in these top tier journals, and even maybe lower tier publications don't even count toward.
Depending on the university and depending on the discipline you're in, every discipline has its own publication requirements, and every university does for tenure. But yeah, so if you are in a high level university, they would either not count or give very, very little weight to a publication in a lowest tier journal. They would say, well, this must not be that good, because if it was good, you'd publish it somewhere else.
So could you give a couple of examples of what, like, a standard between a top tier journal and just even maybe one or two below, in terms of what a standard would be from a history perspective in terms of publishing?
I mean, there's like the Journal of American History, is going to be
top
like
tier.
a top tier. Yeah, I mean.
And what could you not get away with them that you could?
Well, probably this article. I mean, that's probably the reason why it's being published in an online only journal that's
run by Hungarians.
Well, I mean, look, I mean, the authors are, they're stating that it's just a working hypothesis, and so what are some things that we would examine? Well, why wouldn't this get published in a history journal? Well, because there are no documents supporting it. Essentially, the authors, look, again, I have sympathy with the authors. What they're saying is, there's no real explanation for why so many people claim that they had visions of heavenly beings. Clearly, no one actually has visions of heavenly beings. So what's one way we could describe this? I know they're all using hallucinogenics. They're using psychedelic mushrooms. They're using, toad venom. They're using something to make them think that they've had this vision, and that's why they very earnestly believe that they've seen it, but of course they haven't, because it's hallucinogenic induced. And to give you an idea of some of the sources in this journal, when when they're talking about Joseph Smith's, use of hallucinogenics, here's some of the evidences they use, right? That an alleged tutor of Joseph Smith named Luman Walters, who lives in Palmyra, who's affiliated with Joseph in some of the money digging, but I mean, how close their affiliation is, that's all hearsay after the fact by Luman Walters. I mean, Joseph's never like, let me tell you about Luman Walters and what a great friend he was of mine. That he apparently possessed a stuffed toad that he used as part of some magic and some mysticism. And Willard Chase, he's a neighbor of the Smiths. He actually is also employed with Joseph on some of the money digging, and very antagonistic towards Joseph because he feels like Joseph kind of should have split the money with him on the gold plates. He claims that Joseph Smith encountered a spirit that was something like a toad prior to receiving the plates from Hill Cumorah. So because Luman Walters owned a stuffed toad, and because Willard Chase, years after the fact, denigrating Joseph Smith's claim to spiritual accounts in an anti-Mormon book, he's doing this in a deliberate attempt to denigrate Joseph, claims that Joseph saw something like a toad. The authors of this article then say, well, see, that shows that Joseph was obviously using a toad, and he was licking the toad or whatever, and that's the reason why he thought he had a vision. This article, it's filled with things throughout, right? Saying things like, well, there's evidence that this type of fungus grew in the upstate New York area, so therefore he probably used that. And when he moved to Nauvoo, he probably had a bunch of those, northeastern located hallucinogenics shipped out to Nauvoo so that he could have a ready supply of them to continue to still have his visions and his... So, the problem with all of this, there aren't any sources. I mean, the best sources for this are what I just read, right? That an antagonist of Joseph Smith, in recounting Joseph Smith's experience getting the plates, said that he saw something like a toad. So even the person who's antagonistic towards Joseph Smith isn't saying, well, he was just licking the toads, and he's just licking frogs everywhere. That's the reason why he's having these visions. So you have to look at this pretty deeply to say, even the people that are trying to denigrate Joseph Smith's religious experience, the ones on the ground, supposedly his neighbors, they're not claiming that Joseph Smith is using hallucinogens. Now, you do actually have some of the people that are attacking Joseph Smith. I mean, his name is going to be had for good and evil among all nations, kindreds, tongues, and people, right? You do have some of the people in anti-Mormon publications early on claiming that Joseph Smith was drunk when he was translating the Book of Mormon, right? As a way of, his poor character, and, But I've read Joseph Smith's writings when he's sober, and I'll tell you what, I mean, if Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Mormon because he was drunk, you need to send me a case of that. I mean, the reality is, the writing in the Book of Mormon is so far beyond Joseph Smith's actual writing capabilities that we see that it's part of the problem. So what you have here is, it's what I like to call, unisom anti-Mormonism. I'm not claiming that these people are being anti-Mormon. I don't really know what their intent is. Maybe they're just simply trying to provide, but it's certainly antagonistic to what believers have to say.
So you've told me before about a professor, I believe, out of one of the universities in California. She's trying to explain these things, and what was it?
So she's trying to explain. Her name's Ann Taves, and she's trying to take seriously, because she's a trained professor, right? So she's not just, someone on an anti-Mormon subreddit. I mean, she actually has a real job and real publications, and she is trying to provide an alternative explanation for where Joseph Smith's translation of the Book of Mormon came from. And so as a scholar, she has to have an argument that's better than just, I'm sure he just wrote it all himself, because that it doesn't jive with his other writings, right? And so, it's not simply her, but there are other scholars too that have tried to do the same thing. What do we do about the plates? Well, some have even theorized, well, maybe he really did find something. I mean, people did see something. He showed it to a bunch of people. He seems to have something. And plus, he really seems to believe that he's called by God. So maybe he actually did find some Native American artifact. Of course, it wasn't gold plates. And of course, it wasn't about an ancient civilization. Of course, he didn't really translate it. But all of that is really stemming from this problem. Joseph Smith presents a unique problem to religious historians, because gold plates exist and the Book of Mormon exists. If you are simply going off of, Joseph's claim that he had a spiritual manifestation, well, then it's pretty easy to dismiss. You simply say, well, I'm sure he thought he saw God. I mean, a lot of people think they see God. When I was on my mission in Wisconsin, I met someone who thought they were God. I mean, so the reality is, there are people who are earnestly mistaken about the divine all the time. So Joseph Smith must have just been mistaken. Well, however mistaken you might be about whether or not you saw an angel, and by the way, multiple times and on multiple occasions, it's pretty hard to be mistaken whether or not you're hauling 60 or 70 pounds of gold through the forest. Okay? You have something. Now, you either manufactured that something, which is what some antagonists will say. Some antagonists will say, well, sure, what he did is he probably stole a whole bunch of tin and figured out how, created a bellows and figured out how to work the tin, and through metallurgy was able to create a bunch of tin plates. Then he was able to etch those plates, and then he was able to tarnish those plates to make them look like gold. And then he showed them to other people. And even though those people knew much more about metal than he did and would have held those plates and would have known that this is not really gold, they all thought that it was gold because he confused them so well, or he'd already brought them into his treachery. But all those same people actually left the church, so you'd think they would at that point say, actually, Joseph Smith just made this all up, because that'd be the easiest way to get back. I mean, you can see the problem that the plates present. Joseph apparently has something. Even his enemies are saying, oh yeah, I lifted the box, the plates were, and I felt the weight. So he has something. So Joseph either has something that he manufactured or something that he found. Well, which is it? And so these attempts to explain this are ways to try to explain things using a more academic model, in the sense of, how do I explain that Joseph Smith really seems to believe that he was called by God, and at the same time explain these writings that appear to be completely outside of his abilities? Well, what if, and that's what these authors here have done, what if he was taking psychedelic mushrooms, and that's the reason why he thought Jesus appeared to him, and he could honestly believe it? That just wouldn't really work for the production of the Book of Mormon. In that case, someone might say something to the effect of, well, as this scholar has claimed, well, maybe Joseph Smith was an auto-writer. Maybe he fell into trances, as some auto-writers do, and he wrote things that are far beyond his abilities, as some auto-writers do. Again, that is a theory that allows people to have an alternative explanation for how Joseph Smith created something in his subconscious that he clearly wasn't capable of doing in his conscious mind. The problem is, we have dozens of accounts of witnesses who are part of the translation of the Book of Mormon, the scribes who were there, and none of them describe the translation of the Book of Mormon that way. And they not only don't describe the translation of the Book of Mormon that way, they are giving independent accounts of the translation over the course of 60 plus years. And some of them are in private, unpublished accounts. Some of them are published in newspapers. Some of them are simply spoken and recorded in other people's journals, and yet still are all remarkably consistent. So in a future podcast, we're going to cover the witnesses of the translation of the Book of Mormon and discuss how that happened and go over those various sources. But for our purposes here, the fact that someone is claiming, well, wouldn't it make sense that Joseph was able to have these visions or translate the Book of Mormon because he was under a hallucinogenic drug. Look, if you're looking for a reason to explain away Joseph Smith's visions, and that's the one that you think works, obviously you're welcome to believe whatever you want to believe. But in doing so, you need to know that there are no evidences of that. Even the people who hate Joseph are not claiming that he's eating hallucinogenic mushrooms before he receives a revelation. And given the number of revelations that Joseph Smith has, that he's with someone else, collective, shared revelations and revelatory visionary experiences, we're now not just talking about Joseph having to be a part of that hallucinogenic imbibing. We're talking about lots of people having to be involved in it. So, this is something that is printed somewhere. But I think one of the ways that you can determine whether or not something is terribly credible is, are other historians using that as the baseline of their arguments? Are they saying, it's been well established that Joseph Smith was using psychedelic mushrooms when it's not well established at all. And that's the reason why the authors call it a working hypothesis, because what they're saying is, what if Joseph Smith used hallucinogenics? What if? What if an angel came down and gave him gold plates? You can ask the what if questions, but saying what if and hypothesizing is not the same thing as having sources. Sources are what historians go off of. And among all of our sources, among all of Joseph Smith's associates, including people who would later apostatize and attack him as viciously as they possibly can, none of them claim that Joseph Smith was simply under the influence of magic mushrooms when he received his revelations or when he translated the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon itself stands as this great testament of Joseph Smith. The words in it are clearly beyond Joseph Smith's abilities. And if you don't believe me, go read something that Joseph Smith wrote. Go read his 1832 history. You can go to josephsmithpapers.org and read the 1832 history of Joseph Smith. Think about that. He wrote the 1832 history 3.5 years after he wrote the entirety of the Book of Mormon. So, and this is all during this time. He's trying to improve his education. He's trying to become more educated. 3.5 years after the whole Book of Mormon is written, he wrote the 1832 history. And frankly, in a lot of ways, it's a dumpster fire. He's trying to sound good. He's trying to make it sound educated, but he starts thoughts and doesn't finish them. He spells things that he's writing incredibly wrong. He misspells the word keys, which you'd think, since your religion is focusing on the fact that keys have been restored, if there was a word that you would spell correctly, it would be keys, but he spells keys the way you spell bees. The reality is, while Joseph's going to make all kinds of efforts to better educate himself, the Book of Mormon is beyond his 1829 and 28 capabilities. So I think this is one of those, like I said, sometimes I call it unisom anti-Mormonism. It's what allows people to sleep better at night. How do I explain the fact that it seems like Joseph Smith really did have plates? Well, because he went and he stole a bunch of tin and created his own plates. Okay, well, is that possible? It's certainly possible. Is there any evidence at all that he did that? No. So, yeah, it's possible. Is it possible that that Joseph Smith was taking drugs and that's the reason why he had visions? Is it possible? Sure, it's possible for anyone to take drugs. Is there any evidence, aside from it would help you sleep better at night, that he was? No, there's not. I guess you do have his one antagonistic associate who said that he saw a toad, which apparently is the same thing as grabbing it and licking it. You can see why it's only a working hypothesis, and really it's more like a working daydream, and that's probably where it ended up why it ended up where it did. I understand, like I said, I sympathize with the authors in saying, we don't really have a good explanation for why so many people claim to have had visions. Well, we do have one, and it's their explanation, and that is that God really was appearing to them, and that angels really were appearing to them. And yeah, I understand that makes some people feel uncomfortable, and so they prefer an alternative one. But just because you prefer an alternative explanation doesn't mean that explanation is somehow backed up by history. Well, thank you for joining us on this edition of the Standard of Truth podcast. We look forward to answering more questions, so please send those in, and we'll try to answer some in future podcasts. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Standard of Truth podcast, hosted by historian Dr. Garrett Dirkmaat. If you know anybody that could benefit from the material in this episode, please share it with them. And for more resources, visit standardoftruth.com. Until next time.